Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
Travel just about anywhere on this planet, and you're going to find people who are familiar with Jesus of Nazareth because, well, he's hands down the most well-known character in the history of the entire human race. So today on Authentic, we're going to explore why that is.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
Today we're going to look at something I've talked about several times before, but I'm convinced it's important enough that we should probably come back at least one more time. Why is Jesus of Nazareth so important? I mean, here we are nearly 2,000 years after his ministry, and the whole world is still talking about him. He never wrote a book, and apart from his early childhood in Egypt, he never really traveled anywhere. And yet today, out of 8 billion people, almost 2.5 billion claim to be Christians, and nearly 2 billion Muslims still revere Jesus as a prophet. That means that more than half the people living on this planet claim to have respect for this humble peasant carpenter who lived 2,000 years ago. And I'm guessing the number is actually probably higher than that. Nobody else has had that kind of impact on our culture. Walk into just about any bookstore, almost anywhere on the planet, and you're pretty much guaranteed to find books about Jesus, or at least books that mention him. I mean, even some of these weird flying saucer cults you find in places like Southern California, they can't seem to help themselves. Somehow, the so-called aliens making contact with these people always seem to bring up the subject of Jesus, which means that no matter how strange their beliefs, no matter how convinced they are that they're speaking to extraterrestrials, they still kind of realize that Jesus is important enough to our human history that any new religious idea is going to have to try and explain who he was, or just explain him away. So, why is that? What exactly is it about this man that has arrested our collective attention for 2 millennia? I suppose you might explain it by referring to the fact that Rome was the dominant world power of the 1st century. And by the 4th century, the Roman emperor had adopted Christianity as the official religion of state. Now, if they had adopted the faith of Zoroaster at the time, you could argue then Zarathustra would hold the position of honor that is now bestowed on Jesus. We still have Jesus in our culture today because in many ways we are still living in what is really the remnants of the Roman Empire. But honestly, that's an explanation I don't find very convincing because a lot of notable emperors were very fond of pagan deities. And paganism today, as you've likely noticed, is more of a specialty boutique religion for a handful of people. It's not a global phenomenon. I mean, don't get me wrong. I actually have friends who are practicing pagans, so it is a real thing, but it hasn't captivated the world's imagination the way that Jesus has. So, yes, there is an argument to be made that putting the power of the state behind a religion ensures its longevity. But it's not the only factor here by a long shot. I remember back in college when I was not a practicing Christian, I went to some kind of town hall meeting where a heated debate broke out after they opened the mics to the public. Now, to be honest, I don't really remember what the topic of that conference was, but it was almost certainly political because, well, that was my whole world at the time. And whatever the topic was, I do remember this angry man who stood up and made a speech about Christians that was not very flattering. And when he was finished berating them, he said, "It seems obvious to me that Christianity is going to disappear from the earth in the next generation." In fact, I think he might have said 20 years. Now that was 35 years ago, and there are very few signs of Jesus going anywhere. I mean, yeah, there has been a small decline in organized Christian churches during that time, at least here in North America. But globally, Christianity's as big as it ever has been. In fact, it's even bigger, and it's growing. And the question we need to think about is why. And I realize millions of people have tackled this question, and there's just no chance that a half-hour show can do this justice. So maybe I'll just narrow the focus a little bit and look at something I'm convinced is not the reason for Jesus' popularity. And this is something I started thinking about when I was reading Eunapius, a rather well-known Stoic philosopher who lived during the 4th century, at about the time that Rome was transitioning from pagan to Christian. After Constantine died, one of his sons, Constantius II, took his place. And then when he died, we got Constantine's nephew, a man by the name of Julian. And Julian was determined to reverse the Christianization of the Empire of Rome and return Rome to its pagan roots, which is why we call him today Julian the Apostate. And of course, he failed, because Rome became more and more Christian as time went along, to the point where Christians started openly persecuting pagans, which is the part of the story that doesn't often get told from Christian pulpits. So Eunapius the Stoic was living during that time, and his writings, at least what's left of them, give us a glimpse into this rapidly changing world. His most famous work is actually a biography of other philosophers, and at one point he discusses a man by the name of Iamblichus. And what I find fascinating is the fact that Iamblichus had a reputation as a miracle worker. Of course, Jesus also had a reputation as a miracle worker, but most of you have never heard of Iamblichus. So let me read you a little bit from this account of the ancient philosopher. And this is a story where his students come to ask him a question. Nevertheless, they say, a rumor has reached us through your slaves that when you pray to the gods, you soar aloft from the earth more than 10 cubits to all appearance, that your body and your garments change to a beautiful golden hue. And presently, when your prayer is ended, your body becomes as it was before you prayed, and then you come down to earth and associate with us. Apparently, this philosopher would float in the sky when he prayed, which is a much different scenario than the picture we get of Jesus when he prays. In John 17, we have the words of an actual prayer that Christ prayed, a conversation he had with his heavenly Father. And there's no mention of an altered appearance or levitation. I mean, we do find a transfigured Jesus on the Mount in Matthew chapter 18, but that's a different kind of story. For the most part, Jesus looked perfectly human. And when Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, he was a profoundly tortured man, sweating blood. He wasn't levitating above the ground. Of course, Iamblichus never levitated either, and he quickly dispelled the rumor when he heard about it. But then we get a story from the city of Gadara, where the great philosopher appeared to produce living people out of thin air, like a magic trick. Or maybe I should say out of thin water, because that's how the story goes. Here's what it says. He at once touched the water with his hand. He happened to be sitting on the ledge of the spring where the overflow runs off. And uttering a brief summons, he called for a boy from the depth of the spring. He was white-skinned and of medium height. His locks were golden and his back and breast shone. And he exactly resembled one who was bathing or had just bathed. A few minutes later, according to this story, Iamblichus touched another spring and he pulled another boy out of the water. And then when the story's finished, he puts the boys back, and I guess they either dissolved in the water or magically disappeared. And you know what else has magically disappeared? My time. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back to tell you why that very strange story got me thinking.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
One of the few things we know about Eunapius, or Eunapius, I've never really known how to pronounce that, but we know that his history is not exactly airtight. Well, it's more or less a reliable account, or at least an honest retelling of stories the way he understood them. Scholars have noticed a few mistaken details here and there. So, Like with most ancient sources, you've got to take what he says with a grain of salt. Just because he says that one of these ancient philosophers was pulling boys out of the water like a stage magician, it doesn't mean that anybody actually saw that happen. It just means that Eunapius heard about it. But it's these miracle stories that really got me thinking. We know that the teachings of Iamblichus were influential because the Emperor Julian was a fan of his and kept company with some of his disciples. And we know some of what he taught because of the fragments of his writings that survived, and because he is sometimes quoted by others. But what really struck me as odd is the way that Eunapius provides us with none of his teachings. The entire account is almost purely about those signs and wonders. I mean, we have one brief story about a tricky question another philosopher asked Iamblichus, and it went like this. Tell me, philosopher, is a rich man either unjust or the heir of the unjust, yes or no? For there is no middle course. According to the story, Iamblichus deflected that question and just ended the meeting. I suppose it might be a little like Jesus deflecting some of the questions the Pharisees used to try and trap him. But in that case, the questioners were trying to ruin Jesus, not trying to learn something. And that's it. That's all the Iamblichus teaching we have. And honestly, I find that kind of frustrating because if an historical character is known for unusual wisdom, I'd like to read some of that. And whether or not he could perform a miracle is neither here or there as far as I'm concerned. And while Eunapius probably had good reasons for the way he chose to tell the story, I find it frustrating that he never gets to the part I think is most important, what the great philosopher taught. Because that would give me a glimpse of his character and give me some kind of idea who he really was, whether or not he's worth listening to. Now, it's entirely possible that the author thought everybody already knew what Iamblichus taught, so he didn't feel the need to repeat anything. And we do have enough material left over from other sources to kind of piece together some of what he believed. But again, Eunapius only focuses on the miracles. Which brings me back to Jesus. As most of you are aware, because Jesus is still so popular 2,000 years later, the Gospels have more than a few miracle stories. Jesus turned water into wine. He healed the sick and restored sight to the blind. He multiplied the loaves and fishes, and he even raised the dead. There's no question that Jesus worked a lot of miracles. But I want you to think about this. Are those miracles the foundation of the Christian faith? And the answer is no. I would argue that if the Bible didn't record a single miracle from Jesus, he would still command the attention of the whole world today. Of course, there's one miracle that has to happen to make the faith work, and that's the resurrection of Christ. Paul makes a very convincing argument in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus didn't actually come back from the dead, there would be no Christian faith. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty. So, yeah, without the resurrection, there's no Christian faith. And I'd be a fool to argue that the other miracles Jesus performed weren't important because, well, the disciples found them important enough to tell us about them. But are all those signs and wonders the foundation of the Christian faith? Absolutely not. I'd argue that the faith is based on something much deeper. Let me take you over to the real Lord's Prayer now in John chapter 17. And I call this the real Lord's Prayer because, well, Jesus actually prayed it. What we usually call the Lord's Prayer is actually a model prayer that Jesus gave us as a template. But in John 17, we actually get to eavesdrop on Jesus as he talks to his heavenly Father. And here's what he says starting in verse 4. I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. And now, O Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. I have manifested your name. That's another way of saying your character. I have manifested your name to the men whom you have given me out of the world. They were yours. You gave them to me. And they have kept your word. Now they have known that all things which you have given me are from you. So in this prayer, what does Jesus say the purpose of his mission was? He says he came to show us the character of God. What we have in the person of Christ, according to the Bible, is the one and only human being who ever lived a perfect human life. Well, all of us were originally made in the image of God. Jesus is the only one who's ever pulled it off. He lived a life that perfectly reflected the character of God. You might call it the only authentic human life in the history of humanity. And I would argue that this is one of the biggest reasons the name of Jesus is still in circulation to this day. He was different from the rest of us in a very compelling way. And when you're confronted with Jesus, like Pontius Pilate was, you quickly get the sense that he represents what you and I are supposed to be. I think I've mentioned this on another show, but even Thomas Jefferson, who actually took a razor blade to the New Testament to get rid of the miracles, was still astonished with the picture of Jesus left over when he was finished. In a letter to William Short back in 1820, Jefferson expressed deep admiration for what he called the innocence of Jesus' character, the purity and sublimity of his moral precepts, the eloquence of his inculcations, the beauty of the apologues in which he conveys them. In another letter he wrote when he was president, he said this: "The Christian religion, when divested of the rags in which they have enveloped it and brought to the original purity and simplicity of its benevolent institutor, is a religion of all others most friendly to liberty, science, and the freest expansion of the human mind." What Jefferson was doing was trying to make a philosopher out of Jesus, and he used some of Jesus' teachings to help create the American Republic. And what he discovered was that you can take away all of the miracles, all of the supernatural parts of the story, and you still have a very compelling Jesus. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Just before the break, I was talking about Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist. He believed there was a God of some kind out there, but that God probably kick-started this universe and then didn't bother with us after that. Of course, while I certainly respect the intelligence of Jefferson, I mean, he was clearly smarter than me, I find myself in a much different camp because I do believe in a personal God who does intervene in the affairs of humanity. But the real point is this. It's not the miracles that have put Jesus at the apex of history, because whether or not a lame man walked 2,000 years ago isn't really going to change how I live my life today. The person of Jesus, however, certainly does have an impact on who I want to be. I mean, history, it's full of miracle stories, and you'll find supernatural tales connected to the lives of all kinds of famous people, but Jesus is something well beyond that. In fact, the Bible actually cautions against using miracles as proof of anything. Take, for example, the strange parable that you find in Luke chapter 16, where Jesus tells the now famous story of the rich man and Lazarus. Today, some well-meaning Christians have taken that story to be a literal historical account, as if a man living in hell and a man living in heaven were actually able to talk to each other. But the context reveals very clearly that this story is a parable. I mean, just look at the language you find at the top of the story, where Jesus says, "There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day." Now, if you go back through the previous chapters, you'll find Jesus starting a lot of parables with that very same language. There was a certain man who did this or that. And the fact that this story comes after a long string of similar parables tells you this is not a literal account. But now let's get back to the matter at hand, and that's miracles. At the end of this parable, the beggar Lazarus is with Abraham, and the rich man is in torment. It's really a parable about the nation of Israel, who laid claim to Abraham as their father. And it's a story about the Gentiles, who were treated as if they were unclean dogs. And what Jesus is doing with this story is warning the Pharisees that they could quickly lose their chosen people status if they continued the path they were walking. At the end of the story, Jesus has the rich man begging Abraham to raise Lazarus from the dead and send him out to warn his relatives. So, now listen to how Abraham responds. And I don't want you to miss the point. It says, Abraham said to him, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent." So what would that be? That would be a miracle. It continues. But he said to him, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead." So here's what I'm getting at. The New Testament illustrates the deity of Christ with miracles, but it doesn't use those miracles to defend his deity. I mean, just consider the fact that Jesus later literally raised a man named Lazarus from the dead. But the people who saw him do that still wanted to kill him. The miracles didn't cause the religious authorities to believe. In fact, they only deepened their resistance. The New Testament does not appeal to Jesus' miracles to prove he's Messiah. It appeals to the Old Testament to do that. It points to fulfilled prophecy. You'll find this especially in the writings of Paul. Over and over and over and over, he refers to the Old Testament as proof that Jesus is what he claimed to be. That's why I insist that you can discover the deity and the importance of Christ quite apart from the miracles. In fact, you actually have Jesus rebuking the authorities when they ask for one. I mean, just listen to this. Matthew chapter 16. This is a very pointed statement. It says, "Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and testing him, asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, 'When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening.' Hypocrites! You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." And he left them and departed. Instead of working a miracle to convince these guys, Jesus points them to the fulfillment of prophecy. He refers to the signs of the times and tells them that they should know who He is the same way they can read the change of the weather. And then He finishes by telling them that only wicked people demand miracles. So again, I don't for 1 minute doubt the importance of the miracles, and I really do believe they happened. But they are not the foundation of my faith. They only serve to illustrate it. My faith is rooted in the person of Christ because He is utterly unlike anybody in the history of humanity. And the more you get to know who He is, the more you comprehend the character of God. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
All right, I'm completely out of time yet again this week. But let me just take one moment to underline why I find this subject so compelling. There's a tendency for people to believe in the miraculous, but according to the Bible, that can actually get you into trouble. I mean, never forget that Pharaoh's magicians were also able to change walking sticks into snakes like Moses did. And there's no question those guys were playing for the wrong team. In the book of Revelation, it's the second beast who performs the miracles, which serves as a warning that not everything in this world is the way it appears to be. In his first letter to the church of Corinth, Paul says something that every Christian should take to heart. He writes, "For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles." For the Jews, Jesus seemed like a bad fit for Messiah because they assumed that a Messianic king would dispense with the Romans, and a man who died a humiliating death that was usually reserved for criminals, well, he couldn't possibly have the power of God, not as far as they were concerned. The Greeks, on the other hand, were looking for a great philosopher, like Jefferson was. And to them, there was no way that a deity would become a mere physical human being and then die a physical death. What the Greeks wanted was rationality. And it occurs to me that we still have both kinds of people in the Christian world today. We have those who love to dwell on miracles, who love a big show of power, and they fill the airwaves with wonder-working preachers who appear to heal the sick. These people want signs and wonders. But then on the other hand, we also have Christians who reduce the faith to a matter of rationality. And you'll find some of this in the older mainstream churches. These are people who want to philosophize. They want to rationalize everything. And naturally, I am kind of attracted to that side of the equation. But the cross of Christ doesn't really fit, and it demands that we dig a little deeper. You can't easily explain a God who becomes a flesh and blood human being and then dies in a way that, well, it doesn't make sense to most people. This is just not a simple concept. When you read the words of Christ, the ones preserved here in the pages of the Bible, you're going to find that there's nothing facile, nothing easy about His teaching. It's not easy, and it runs against the grain of conventional wisdom in a very oddly compelling way. Which is why I urge you to put aside the books you've read about Jesus and the movies you've watched about His life and just read the Bible. Read the source document for yourself. This is not a simplistic faith, and there's a reason that people have clung to this book now for thousands of years. Something like 4 billion people still respect and even revere this humble carpenter from Nazareth, and there's a really good reason for that. And like Elijah waiting for God in a cave, you're not going to find that reason in the spectacular. You're going to find it in the small, still voice that continues to speak through the most memorable man in the history of the world. I'm Shawn Boonstra. You've been watching Authentic. Thanks for joining me.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.